boys and girls, rock stars of all ages, the God of Thunder, Rikki Roxx, Lord of Rock and Roll, here to welcome you to the first of what hopefully will turn out to be a series. Now, anybody who knows anything about me at all knows that aside from pro wrestling, one of my favorite things in this life is action figures. Collecting action figures is something I've been into my whole life. I'm not going to tell you how long that is because it's none of your business, but the fact of the matter is, I've been collecting action figures my whole life. My dad got me into it, God rest him. I still remember being about 3 years old, walking home with my mom from Toys R Us with the original Castle Grayskull playset from He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, just to give you some idea of how long I've been in this specific game for. Now, aside from He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, one of my favorite things on this earth, of course, is the Man of Steel himself, Superman. Anybody who knows me at all knows that by now. And going back to the beginning once again, the most heartbreaking thing in my childhood was actually having the original Kenner Superpowers Superman action figure from the mid-'80s. It was one of my earliest action figures. And unfortunately, when I was about 3 or 4 years old, we moved, and somehow it got lost in the move, and I was never able to find one again. By then, they weren't in stores anymore, and that was heartbreaking. To this day, I still haven't been able to find one, and that's unfortunate, but who knows? I'm sure they'll turn up. They show up all the time, but they're a little expensive. So what I'm hoping for is that... What the... Saxophones? You gotta fucking be kidding me! Will turn up that's a little bit more reasonable, and we'll see how that goes. But it's definitely a grail piece for me, something I've always been chasing. But I've since then been able to amass a huge Superman collection. I've been fortunate enough to find Superman action figures of all shapes and sizes and colors of the rainbow. So I figured that the first episode of From the Vault, Rikki Roxx Retro Action Figure Review should involve Superman, the Man of Steel himself. Since I've got dozens of Superman figures, and over time I'll be able to show you more than a few of them, I hope. Now, unlike some of the toy review videos that are out there, I'm going to be doing it my way. For one, I'm new at this, so, be gentle. Number two, I don't keep a lot of stuff mint or in box. I'd have to live on the roof if I did that, because I'd have no room for anything, because I have thousands of action figures from Jakks, WWE, from Mattel, He-Man, and DC Direct, DC Superheroes, just a few of my favorites. So I've got a little bit of everything. And over time, I'll be showing you some of it. A lot of it won't be in box. I know some people like to see the unboxing thing. 99% of the packages for my stuff has been thrown out for decades. But the fact is, some of it will be new. Or at least new to me. And that brings us to today. I figured for the first episode, we should focus on Superman. So today, I went out and I picked up a few things, but I picked this piece up specifically for this first episode of Rikki Roxx Retro Action Figure Review from the Vault. We're going to look at the Mattel DC Justice League Superman animated series action figure. Now this is one, it's pretty common, or at least the style of it is. I swear they repackaged this figure at least 500 times in various collections and whatnot. Now, the fact is, even though I'm a huge Superman fan, I didn't collect these when they were new, for a couple different reasons that we're going to talk about today. I do love it, though. I mean, just at a glance, the art style is incredibly accurate to the cartoon itself, which is fantastic. The reason I shied away from these originally, though, is specifically because two reasons. Number one, this came out in about 2002. I was not really collecting action figures at this point. I got away from it a little bit before getting back into it. But secondly, aside from being more selective in my purchases, as much as I love the art style, this wasn't what I was looking for in a Superman toy back then. I was and am very heavily into the comic book version of Superman, so what I prefer is generally a more comic book style action figure, which unfortunately has not been done a million times, or at least hadn't been done very often up to this point, about 2002. This is what you would find most often on shelves. This is what you saw everywhere from Toys R Us to Kmart, and I really like it. It's incredibly accurate, but it wasn't what I was specifically looking for at that time, so I passed on these then. But I am interested in collecting them now. This was a whole line that Mattel ended up doing. What the Yes, it's gotta be real, Dolphin Jerry. We're feeding this shit to school kids. What the fuck is wrong with you? And as you can see here, we have on the front the whole Justice League roster from the cartoon show, including Hawkgirl. Although if you look on the back, cameraman, zoom it! And you see the back there if you can. And you only see 6 of the figures, which is interesting. I'm not sure why they only did 6, especially because Hawkgirl's on the front of the package, but I'm sure I'll figure that out. As you can see, each of the 6 figures in this wave comes with its own display base, something I think is really cool. At a glance, it's perfect. The package, as you can see, is pretty banged up. Somebody even tried to use tape to kind of hold it together, but the blister pack's peeling off. I didn't pay a lot for this. You could find this figure loose on the internet for about $8 to $10. Packaged, I'm not sure, but I'd be shocked if it was more than $15. So it's pretty easy to track down. Normally, I know, again, a lot of people don't like to see people take things out of the package. I know it's heartbreaking and physically painful for some of you to watch, so we're not going to look at it. I am going to open this guy. Again, the blister's peeling off and the cardboard is all messed up, so I'm not heartbroken over it. So we're going to take it out and I'm going to look it over a little bit. You're going to see my gut reactions. But just know that it does physically hurt me every single time that I take one of these out of the package. So don't think I'm a heartless beast. It's just a practical thing. You know, my stuff goes on a shelf for display. I don't keep them trapped in plastic because I just would have no room and I only have one house. So we're going to take a look at this guy and we'll be right back. Okay, so first thing I want to mention is this guy came right out of the package. The glue was so deteriorated that the blister pack came right off the cardboard with barely any scarring at all, so that's pretty cool. I'm not in love with the packaging. It is cool though. I forgot to talk about it before, but the packaging for these figures is really striking. Jumps out, I imagine, on the shelf. It certainly jumped out at me. I got this at a flea market, Funkenstein Wrestling Superstore, Englishtown Flea Market, Englishtown, New Jersey. Saturdays and Sundays. Check them out. They close by 3, so get there early, but they have an amazing selection of not just wrestling figures, but a million little things like this. So check them out. I'm not paid to say that, by the way. That's just what's in my heart. So anyway, in the midst of all the bric-a-brac in this amazing flea market store, the packaging for this guy jumped out at me from across the room, and that's what made me want to pick him up. So I should have mentioned that earlier. Sorry, it's after 5 on a Saturday, so I've had a couple of these. But the fact of the matter is, I went there Christmas shopping, but I knew I had to come home with this guy for myself. Again, in 2002, even though I love the style of the Justice League animated artwork, it wasn't what I was looking for in a Superman figure back then, if that makes any sense. Now, in brief, when the DC Direct line of figures came out that were specifically comic book accurate, I got heavy into collecting those for exactly that reason. All the characters looked exactly like they did on the printed page, and that's what I wanted. But these guys here are based on the cartoon show that millions of people grew up with, millions of people are in love with, and I am too. It's a fantastic show. Not my favorite version of the DC Universe, but one of them. And of course, you can't have the DC Universe without Superman. So here he is, fresh out of the package for the first time in almost 20 years. And this is not my first animated Superman figure, but I believe the first one I've taken out of the package. At a glance, I love this guy. He's entirely accurate to the art style of the cartoon. I'm always a fan of the darker blue. If you want to zoom in a little bit on that for a second, if you can, the blue is probably my favorite type of Superman blue. I know some people like a a lighter shade, like a 70s Christopher Reeve type. But this was more of a modern take, which I enjoyed. I want to point out the S shield in particular. I'm a huge fan of the S shield on this figure, and I'll tell you why. Because historically, especially with action figures, they've been a little sloppy with what I feel is the most important part. The thing that makes it Superman is the S shield. And in the Justice League cartoon show, one of the things that used to drive me nuts is that they always drew the S really sloppy, like they didn't care. But on this figure, this is actually one of the better drawn S shields. So I'm a huge fan of that. I give them a lot of points for that, because they could have gone lazy with it, especially in the vein of the cartoon show. The cape is like a soft rubber, as you can see. No S shield on the back, which is accurate to the cartoon show, but always drove me nuts. I mean, without the yellow or golden shield on the back of the cape, you know, it's generic as hell. I understand why a lot of versions don't go with it, but to me, it's essential. Gotta have the S. But I can't really take points off for this because he didn't have it in the cartoon show either. Because they didn't want to draw it. Because they were lazy. So fuck them. Anyway, so looking at the rest of the figure, you got your basic articulation for a late 90s, early 2000s figure. The head just swivels on a peg like that. Little stiff, again, right out of the package, but moves pretty good. No trouble with the arms there, up and down. Again, just the basic up and down shoulder articulation. No elbows yet. A lot of you youngsters, and I'm dating myself here, but you may not remember that elbow and knee joints, that's like a 2004 or later kind of innovation for action figures. Before 2003, a lot of action figures didn't have elbows or knees. It seems stupid now, but that's the way it was, and we liked it. At the time, nobody who picked this figure up would have even complained about it. It wasn't expected yet. Now you got your 36 points of articulation, everything from double jointed knees to, you know, whatever, and that's all great. Love it. Can't get enough of it. But I'm just pointing out for anybody younger who might be watching, who could look at this guy and be like, "Oh, his knees don't even bend." You're right, but we didn't care. And again, kids would play with this guy or just put him on a shelf and they'd be perfectly happy with it. I know I'm perfectly happy with it for what it is. You know, again, the joints aren't stiff at all, which sometimes is a concern with some of these older action figures. They've been sitting for so long, not getting any oxygen. Sometimes the joints are stiff, but this guy moves great. I'd give this to a little kid to play with if I wasn't a selfish prick, and I would not be afraid of them breaking it because it is made for that. It's built for that kind of play style. The size of it is, again, pretty standard for what toys were at the time. Obviously, they're a lot bigger now, which again lends itself to better articulation. Sponsorship deal. And, you know, it's a great figure. Superman himself's a little pale, but flesh tones are something that a lot of mass-produced action figures kind of cheap out on, so I'm not too concerned with that. Basic pose, just stand still. Can't do a lot with them, but again, we wouldn't have complained back then. I'm not complaining now. The hands are interesting. You got one closed fist and one open hand, which I like. I always liked that, but I would have switched them. Because Superman throws a mighty right hook, and I definitely would have given him the fist in his right hand if I were booking it. But nobody asked me. It's cool. I think it's great. Overall, figure itself, no complaints. I'm looking at the paint all over this guy, and if I'm seeing any flaws, like I see a little tiny little speck of blue on top of a red spot, and that's about it. Paint job on this guy is great. It's as line perfect as I've seen on a mass-produced action figure based on a cartoon. There's a little bit, like there's two spots. There's a little bit of flesh tone on the back of his hair. And on the back of one of his boots, there's a tiny little speck of blue over the red. You can't even see it. I would definitely not take points off. It's as perfect as it gets, especially at this scale. I prefer a much bigger action figure. I like bigger, taller Superman figures with more articulation. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this guy here is about as good as it gets if you're a fan of animated Superman and you like the art style, which I'll talk about briefly. Again, I have no problem with the art style, but it's definitely not my favorite. It's very stylized, which works well for a cartoon show, but the Popeye arms and chicken legs always bothered me, not gonna lie. You know, it just looks odd, and it definitely makes this style of figure stand out, but at the same time, when you see it next to other more realistically proportioned figures, yeah, those stylistic choices definitely make it stand out, not always in a positive way, but it's fine, you know, I like it, it's just not my favorite, and I'm not sure if I would have done anything differently for the cartoon show itself, but these toys are perfect for the cartoon show, and I love it. In addition to the figure itself, you get a display base. I'm always a huge fan of this, not always in this style though. Well, I don't want to misspeak. I think this is a really awesome idea. You've got the peg to help him stand up. You've got the character's logo. If you remember looking on the back of the package, each character came with one of these with their own unique logo and a few letters for the larger Justice League logo. So the idea was you'd stand everybody up together on their bases and you'd make like a little display platform, which is really cool. The only problem I have with it is that it's long instead of wide. I probably would have flipped it, to be honest, just because when you're standing these guys on a shelf, they're going to take up a lot of room for not necessarily a great reason. You know, putting anything in front of them is going to be incredibly difficult. I'm never a huge fan when any toy line does a long base versus a wide base, but right now, this is the only one of these that I own, so it's not going to be a problem. But I love the logo in the middle. I love that each of the bases connects to make a bigger logo. I think that's great. I just would have done a couple things differently, but again, I didn't book it. And lastly, each figure comes with their own movable, they used to call that, movable technology trading card with the Justice League logo on the back. Okay, with each of the members standing prominently in front of the Justice League logo. I think that's fantastic. I think this with the Superman in the different poses, flying and breaking the chains, I'm not sure how well the camera is going to pick that up, but you see as you move the card, the motion changes a little bit, and this makes a great backdrop, goes right into the display stand like that, and voila. So he's shelf ready now. Again, no problems with this specific action figure. I think for what it is and what it was trying to be, it's about as perfect as it gets. I think it's great. I love it. Between the art style itself, the paint job, the base, and the card, I'll go 9 out of 10 if I'm going to give it any kind of grade. I'm going to be loose with this. I'm just talking right now. I'm rambling. I'm not going to grade everything. I don't care that much. But the fact is, I love this guy, and it's perfectly accurate to the cartoon show, and you got a lot for your money. This guy probably came out for about $8 to $10. And you got the base and the card and everything with that. Yeah, I know what she said. Listen, if Susan Sarandon gave a shit about feeding hungry kids so much, she'd start by taking off her shirt. You can find them on the internet really cheap, very reasonable prices. I don't see why you wouldn't pick them up if you're a Superman fan, especially if you love the cartoon. Not my favorite Superman figure, but it is fantastic. Just for comparison, we're going to cut away in a second, and we're going to show you something else, and then we're going to wrap this up. Alright, now just for the sake of comparison, we're going to look at today's figure, the Justice League animated Superman figure, with a couple of my other favorite Superman figures, and just to get a sense of compare and contrast here. So again, obviously I like a larger figure. So as far as animated Supermans go, or at least reminiscent of animated, we have the Mattel DC Super Friends version of Superman from a couple of years ago. I think maybe 2 years ago, 2017, 2018, somewhere around that. Feel free to correct me. I don't give a shit. But this is a great figure. It's ostensibly based on the 1980s Super Friends cartoon show with the classic costume and the cloth goods cape. The likeness isn't 100%, but it's a great figure, and it's based on the cartoon show from the 80s, so I thought I would include it here just for a sense of contrast with the late 90s, early 2000s animated Superman. And finally, we have a more basic DC Direct style Superman, specifically based on the comic book. This came out from DC Direct in the mid-2000s, around 2005 or so. I'm pretty sure this one was from the Justice League box set rather than the Superman Series 1. But again, you'll see that the darker blue was in fashion for that late 90s, early 2000s Superman figure, and that's what I prefer. And again, these two based on animated versions of Superman, and this one based on strictly the comic books, just to give you a sense of compare and contrast. I love all of these figures for different reasons. They're some of my favorite pieces that I own. This guy now, he's going right up on the shelf next to these other guys, even though scale-wise, he totally doesn't fit. But I've got so many Superman figures, and you're going to see 100 million of them before it's all over with, or at least about 30, because that's what I got. And that's going to just about wrap it up for today. So just to give you an idea, these are 3 of my favorite Supermans, including this one now. But there's going to be a whole lot more in the future. If I decide to do more of these, we'll see what happens. Well, guys, that's going to wrap it up for the first ever Rikki Roxx From the Vault retro action figure review. I hope you enjoyed it. Click like, comment, do whatever you want to do. I don't care. I got shit to do, but I do hope that I made you laugh. I hope that maybe triggered some nostalgia or something. If you collect action figures, I'd love to know what. If you have this figure, that's cool too. Just kind of let me know. And I'm always open to discussion. If you're on my Facebook, then that means I like you. So feel free to talk to me about action figures, new, old, DC, He-Man, WWE, WCW, whatever you're into. I'm always down for talking about that. And that's going to just about wrap it up for today. I've got so much more. We could be here for weeks, months, and years, and maybe we will be. We will see. It really kind of depends on you guys. So that's going to take it from here. I'm Rikki Roxx, the God of Thunder, the Lord of Rock and Roll, Pro Wrestling's Axl Rose, and the Man of 1,000 Nicknames, and we're taking it home from the vault.